Hey, what's up, guys? We have Uther Naysmith here. He is a lawyer and also advocates for socialism. So, how's it going, Uther? How you doing today?
Good, thanks. Yeah, yeah. I should say I'm not a practicing lawyer, but I do have a law degree from the University of Oxford, and I've just completed a master's degree in law from the University of Edinburgh. And when I say just, I mean like a couple of weeks ago. So I'm still recovering from that experience. Um, so yeah, it's going well with me, thanks. I'm trying to get back into politics. I used to be a member of the British Labour Party, supporting a man called Jeremy Corbyn, who was the Labour Party leader in this country, and he sort of was like the British Bernie Sanders, if you want to call him that, sort of a centre-left, social democratic type figure, wanted to tax the wealthy a little bit more and redistribute wealth to healthcare and education and things like that. But um, since 2020, the Labour Party's been led by a man called Keir Starmer, who is a much more right-wing figure. He's probably more right-wing than Joe Biden, I'd say. And a lot of Labour members like myself have been fed up with what we think are broken promises, and so we've cut up our membership cards and left the party over that. So I'm feeling good. It's nice to have a qualification to my name, and I'm just enjoying the break. But British politics is not doing so good at the moment.
Yeah, so technically you're not a lawyer yet because you're not practicing, right? So you can't like call yourself a lawyer just because you have like the degree or whatever.
No, yeah, you have to do it. Well, like the bar course and that those kinds of professional qualifications first. And I don't know if I want to. I mean, there's so much you can do with a law degree that isn't just law. There's you can go into law if you want to, but you could also go into politics, work for charity, work for the government. There's lots of different doors opened by that, and I don't know if I have the stomach for law. We'll see. I'm still
Yeah.
making decisions.
Yeah, so you haven't taken the bar yet then.
No, not yet, not yet. My plan is to
Okay.
take some time out because I went straight into the masters, and it was a lot of work, and I'm feeling pretty exhausted after all of it. So I think I need a good holiday.
Yeah. Yeah, like what you mentioned this, you don't have the stomach for it. Like I feel like that's true for me too. It's like there was a lot of stuff that I wanted to do. Like I actually majored in psychology, but I thought about well, first I wanted to be a computer programmer, but then I just couldn't do that. And so then I majored in psychology and I was like, well, what's my options? It's basically becoming a psychologist. But I was like, I don't know if I have the stomach for that. You know what I mean? Like I don't know if I can handle like people coming in with like some serious stuff.
Mm.
But yeah, so it's like I think it's like different going to school and then after school actually doing it. It's a much different thing. But yeah,
Yeah.
obviously for you getting in, it sounds like you're already getting into politics, which is good. So you mentioned your was the guy you mentioned there, your is he the leader of England right now? The guy who's more right
Okay.
than Biden?
Do you know much about British politics at all, or?
No, no.
Okay.
And
Well,
I'd rather I don't want to get too far into British politics because I
yeah,
want to make sure we go over the socialism part. But yeah. But whatever you want to say about it.
sure. Yeah, Keir Starmer is the leader of the Labour Party, but he's in opposition at the moment. So, like, sort of the closest equivalent I could think of would be like the minority leader of the Senate, like sort of the Mitch McConnell type figure. Um, that's Keir Starmer, and we had our last general election actually in 2019, in like December 2019, so a year before you guys did. And the Labour Party, which I was a member of, lost very, very badly to the Conservatives. At the time, it was Boris Johnson. Currently, the Prime Minister, like the head of government in Britain, is a man called Rishi Sunak, who is a billionaire politician with a lot of business connections. Um, and he's your, traditional like economic conservative, pro-capitalism, pro-free market, pro-corporation. Um, and Keir Starmer is, the opposition leader, and we've got an election next year, and you kind of expect him to put up a bit more of a challenge to that. But He doesn't support, workers going on strike. He doesn't support, lifting tuition fees or things like that. And he's supporting, more like privatized healthcare. So really, really poor show for what is meant to be, the Labour Party in Britain, sort of like the Democrats, meant to be a left-wing party. He's being a very, very right-wing politician, unfortunately.
Okay, yeah. And so you basically have the Labor Party and then you have the
The
Republicans.
Conservative.
So
Yeah, so the Conservatives. So the Labour Party is sort of like the
conservatives.
Democrats. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. So the Conservative Party in Britain is sort of like your Republicans, and the Labour Party in Britain is sort of like the Democrats. Except I'll be honest, I think the Republican Party in America is a lot more right wing than even our right wing party here. Like a lot of Conservative Party MPs in Britain are much more left wing than Republicans in America. And so we sort of tend to look on American politics with a bit of horror in this country, yeah, and the rest of Europe.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then you kind of mentioned he's more right than Biden. Would you almost say that Biden is more he's almost more right wing than left wing? He's acting as a liberal, but he's really kind of
Yeah, basically. I mean, the one thing where I'll say I really respect Joe Biden is his policies on labor unions, and like supporting the Starbucks workers and the Amazon workers getting their union. And he's been like really good in the people he's appointed to the National Labor Relations Board. So I've been impressed with that. But apart from that, I hate to say it, like most American politicians, he's a pretty right-wing figure. I mean, and this is quite a good springboard into the discussion about socialism, actually. Because the problem I think
yeah.
with the problem with modern politics is that it doesn't matter what party you're from. All the politicians in the Western world, in Britain, in America, everywhere, they all agree about fundamental things in society. So they all agree that privatization is good to a certain extent. They all agree that the free market is good. They all, agree with this sort of capitalist economic system. It doesn't matter whether you vote for Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump on the fundamental facts about our system. They all have the same policies. And as a voter, it can feel quite depressing being given a choice between two or three or four parties, and all of them are basically the same party.
Although what I've heard is that like somebody like Bernie Sanders would actually move the needle more left than Biden. Like Bernie Sanders is somebody who actually wants to implement like um what's it called, UBI, universal basic
Yeah.
income, and like a minimum wage that's higher, and then also like I think I'm pretty sure, I'm assuming he just wanted to do socialized healthcare like you guys have. So yeah, let's just, I mean, obviously I want to get into the politics of it all, but that can be a little bit confusing for me. Well, so is socialism, but so let's go into socialism, and then we can kind of come back to the particular parties of the US and England. So first of all, I had a communist guy on. I found him on Reddit and he seemed to be pretty knowledgeable, but I really wanted to get into communism, also socialism, and then also not so much get into capitalism, but I mainly want to know the differences between all the options we have. Are those basically the three options: socialism, communism, capitalism, or is there other ones? Or is capitalism even fit in the same idea as socialism and communism? You know what I mean? Or not
Yeah,
same
that's
idea, but same social structure or whatever.
yeah, that's actually a really good question. Can I just ask, by the way, you're recording this, are you going to use the footage as well as the sound?
If that's okay with you, yeah.
Yeah, that's fine, but do you mind if I hate to say this, do you mind if I smoke
Oh
while we're
no,
recording?
not at all. I mean, as you can see, I'm vaping, so
Right, yeah, yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
noticed you were smoking. Are you smoking? Is that cigarettes or is it weed or what?
Tobacco cigarette, yeah.
Okay, okay, okay. No, I actually
But
was gonna, I was actually gonna say I like that you're smoking. It kind of gives it more of like a old school kind of,
lefty intellectual from the 1960s. Yeah, especially
exactly.
yeah, yeah.
Especially being
Um,
English, like a John Lennon, like Beatles type thing.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I take that as a compliment. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, we can sort of start with that question about, was it what's the difference basically, and are these the only two options?
Yeah. And are those
Um,
the main three, or is there like other ones that I'm kind of missing that I don't even know about?
yeah, okay. Well, I mean, it's kind of the answer you get to this question will depend on who you ask. I mean, I come at it obviously from a left-wing perspective, so I'll answer it from that perspective. But on the left, amongst socialists, Marxists, communists, you've got so many different ideas about how society should be organized. Like you have Marxist Leninists, and you have Maoists, and you have um, social democrats, and impossibilists, and Christian socialists, and oh my God, just like an infinite variety of different ideas about what socialism is supposed to be. Um, I think in the past 100 years, I'll start here. In the past 100 years, there's been two really sort of big ideas of socialism, both of them inspired more or less by the writings of Karl Marx. One I would call Leninism, and the other I would call social democracy. And Leninism, of course, is like what they did in the Soviet Union. It's the command economy, the state control, um, getting rid of all the capitalists a bit forcefully, the political repression and all that. Um, And then in the West, the socialist movements we saw there in Britain, France, Germany, even America, back 100 years ago with people like Eugene Debs, really interesting figure. You had this more sort of, it developed into social democracy, which is like this idea that the way to achieve a socialist society is bit by bit reforms, public health care, public housing, public education, taxes on the rich, maybe nationalizing the railways or the energy companies here or there, but doing it gradually, democratically, etc. And well, that idea is fine as far as it goes. I don't object to that as such, but I think what's happened in the world over the past sort of 40 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War and that, like I am one of the Soviet Union's biggest critics. I don't think it was a good model for us to follow in the modern era. But since the end of the Cold War, the left wing in politics has sort of been on the retreat and surrendering their ideals one by one. And certainly in the West, with the Labour Party in Britain, the Socialist Party in France, the Social Democratic Party in Germany, I feel like they've kind of run out of ideas. And so when you ask me, oh, is this it? What are the alternatives? I think there's a real problem with a lack of imagination on the left to actually go out and propose a different way of organizing society. But if you go back and read like the very, very basic idea that Karl Marx and the original sort of first, second generation socialists had, the basic idea is a world without, how do you put it? A world without money and exploitation. Uh, and you have the common ownership of resources instead of, resources being privatized like water, housing, land, electricity, and so on and so forth. These things should be the common heritage of mankind, freely available to every person. And um, that's the idea. And essentially, the last 100 years have just been people arguing about how to achieve it, really. That's the in a nutshell version. We can go in more depth from there, I guess.
Yeah, but in terms of just to like boil it down to, and you did do a good job at explaining all of it, but to boil it down, I guess to boil it down to capitalism, well, communism, and socialism. Well, first of all, one of the main differences, because you hear about communism all the time, but then you hear, okay,
Mm.
communism is a little too extreme, so let's maybe be more socialist. But then there's
Right.
us
Yeah.
here in America that's just like almost we're probably the most straight capitalist, right? I don't know if there's any more less less regulated capitalism than the United States, right? So in terms of, well, first of all, yeah, are those the main three?
Um, yeah, effectively. I mean, capitalism is a system based on the private ownership of resources and machinery. You know, the factories, the farms, the mines, the railways. Communism is meant to be. I mean, it didn't work like this in practice in Russia, but it's meant to be a system where these things are owned by the whole community and used for the benefit of the whole community to satisfy the needs of everybody and not the needs of profit-making corporations. Uh, and to most people see sort of socialism as this sort of in between. I mean, the word we would use for that in Europe is social democracy, but it's this sort of mixed economy where the state takes control of these resources on behalf of the public, or some of them, and then other things like food or clothes continue to be privatized. Um, I mean, I couldn't see another way of organizing society necessarily, but that doesn't mean they're not out there. You know, anarchists, for example, they have their own view about what should be done. I'm not really familiar with their theory, but they want like a radically decentralized system of power. And then you have fascists who were sort of weird off in their own corner. But I think really looking at the planet as a whole, the choice is between capitalism or socialism slash communism, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, and then like you were saying, the left hasn't really come up with like any other good ideas. But so the guy that I was talking with about communism before was also saying that it wasn't so much socialism, communism, and capitalism isn't so much a way of government. It's more of a means of production, right? So there's like a little bit of a difference between like say maybe anarchism than say capitalism in terms of the meaning, because capitalism is dealing more with like money and how you make money and how you give out money, whereas anarchism is more of like a or like democracy or whatever, anarchism, democracy, or what you guys had with like the kings and the queens. What's it called?
Yeah, like
Mo-
feudalism, aristocracy,
or monarchism,
monarchy,
or
monarchy.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. So so you have the three means of production ideas, basically, right? But then you also have um I don't know what it would be called, like a way of government, kind of like a democracy would be considered like what like
yeah.
you know what I mean? Like there's
I
a
get you.
difference,
Yeah,
right? What I'm saying. Yeah, I'm kind of new to this, so yeah.
yeah. I mean, the thing is, like, if you read like left wing or Marxist like theory on this kind of thing, the idea of um, there's this certain idea of history called historical materialism, um, which kind of comes from the perspective that society evolves naturally in stages based on the level of technological advancement. So, like, now we live in a global capitalist system with, you know, the modern technology we have today, electricity, modern medicine, etc. Um, you go back to the 1300s and you have feudalism based on, you know, the serfs, the land, the lords, etc. Um, and what Marxists, and I'm not saying I disagree with every point they make, but I think it's interesting to think about is what Marxists say is like society naturally evolves. First, we saw it in the 1800s from feudalism to capitalism. And then in the future, the sort of objective is to evolve from a capitalist society to a communist one. Um, and the really defining feature of capitalism that we live in today is that everything is about money. Um, all the decisions made by governments, all the decisions made by corporations, they're all about maximizing profit. And you as an individual, you don't get a choice over that. You're sort of forced into this rat race to compete with other people for jobs, for resources, and so on and so forth. Whereas if we used like the modern technology that we've spent the last, 2000 years slowly developing, artificial intelligence, automation, etc. If we use those to satisfy people's needs instead of to make money for a handful of billionaires, then naturally people would not be in competition with one another to fulfill our basic needs, and you'd find a healthier, more natural sort of human relationship and style of government emerging. So, like if you live in a feudal system, a monarchy makes sense. If the land is owned by barons or whatever, and you have these serfs working on it. A monarchy is sort of a reasonably sensible system to come up with to rule over it. If you live in a capitalist society where you have all these people competing as individuals, sort of republicanism makes sense. You know, one man or one person, one vote, this sort of formal equality before the law. You all get to vote for who the president or the prime minister is or whatever. And then in the future, in this sort of hypothetical communist or socialist society, you'd have an altogether different form of government that gives the best expression to that way of life, if that makes sense. And I think it would be more decentralized, sort of like what anarchists want, and more direct democracy. Instead of voting for a president, you'd see more like local governments, more autonomous, like communities making their own decisions instead of being controlled from outside. But, you know, again, it depends on what kind of communist you're talking to, really.
Yeah. So is this kind of like the overall idea that you think will happen, or is this kind of like Marxist idea of what would happen, which would be feudalism to capitalism
Yeah.
to communism?
So that's Marx's idea. And, you know, a lot of people have criticized this theory, saying, oh, it's unscientific, etc. I don't know. I'm not like well placed to judge it. I think there is something you can learn from it. I think there is some truth to it. Nothing is inevitable, but when you read what Marx actually says in his own words, I think it makes a lot of intuitive sense. And, you know, it's a tool to help you understand the world. It doesn't have all the right answers, but it's a way to get you to start thinking about the right questions and the right issues. So no, I don't think communism is inevitable, or anything like that. But I
Although
think when,
it does make
oh,
sense.
sorry,
Sorry to cut you off, but it does
no
make
worries.
sense in terms of the way things are going because of all the AI and the robots and stuff. They're kind of saying we're going to get to a point where like we're going to need UBI because our jobs will be taken away. So yeah.
Right, yeah. And that is a perfect example of something that, you know, a Marxist would say, oh, that's historical materialism. These new technologies come in, they change the way we work, change the way we make resources, make industrial goods, and so on. And suddenly you find job losses all over the world. Well, there are two responses to that. Either we share the wealth a bit better, either we move towards socialism, or, you know, you have food riots because people don't have any money, and you know, they go out on the street demanding work or bread. Just and you know, there are examples of this from history, like when the first machines were invented to spin cotton, they put a lot of people out of work in the early 1800s, and they went out and smashed up the machines. The Luddites in England were a group of factory workers that were complaining about their wages being lowered because of increased productivity, because of cotton spinning machines. And they dressed up as women and smashed up factories, and a lot of them were hanged for it. You know, it's perfectly feasible that automation would see similar kind of, like, not to the same extent, but would see protests or social problems coming about because people are being impoverished by new technology. And you have to have a social response to that. You know, these AI automated technologies, if you want to get the best outcomes from the invention of these technologies, they have to be socially owned by the whole community, because you'll always get a bad outcome if they're owned by, you know, corporations or billionaires or whatever, because they're out there to maximize their profits. And I'm not saying that makes them bad people. You know, that's what they're meant to do. That's what they're there for. But they act from self-interest. If you want technology to benefit humanity, it has to be owned by humanity. And so that's kind of a actually really good example of, you know, that kind of Marxist theory in practice is, yeah, what do we do about automation? You've hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah. So getting into communism and socialism, like you hear a lot about, okay, you hear all the time, communism doesn't work. Like the Soviet Union tried it, China tried it. I think currently Cuba is Are they communists? Are they socialist?
I mean, they call themselves. I think they personally would use both words to describe themselves. This sort of distinction between communism and socialism was sort of developed by Lenin. I mean, Karl Marx himself treated the terms as interchangeable. At one point in his life, he called himself a communist. At another point in his life, he called himself a socialist. You can use either word, but basically, the idea of communism slash socialism is a world based on social ownership of resources rather than private ownership. And this idea that, everybody puts into the system and everybody gets out of it. It's that age-old quote, that famous quote, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. That's the objective of socialists and communists. But yeah, I mean, the communist, quote unquote, communist system in the Soviet Union, that didn't work. But you have to ask yourself, why didn't it work? I mean, there were lots and lots of problems in the way they ran their system. I think, the authoritarianism, the political repression, and you see it in China and you see it as well, sadly, in Cuba. But also these countries, especially China and Russia, they were some of the most technologically underdeveloped countries in the world when they were taken over by the Communist Party. Like Russia, for example, had only just abolished feudalism in like the 1860s. And even then it continued for like 20 years after that unofficially, sort of like the Reconstruction in the US South. They ended slavery in name only. Similar thing with feudalism in Russia. And so by like the First World War, Russia was a very unindustrialized country. It was a peasant society. It was a rural agricultural society, miles behind somewhere like Britain or Germany, which was like the industrial heartland of the world in the 1910s. And so when Lenin took over Russia, he was faced with this sort of incredibly unindustrialized country that had no hope of achieving anything like communism, because in order to have a society where, resources are owned collectively and everybody, this not universal basic income, but universal basic services, you need to have advanced technology for that, because it's the only way you can make sure that resources are distributed to everybody. And so I think that's a large part of why they failed in Russia. But in the modern world, with computers and the internet and things, it would be much, much easier to implement that kind of system.
Yeah. And then so in terms of, so basically to answer the question, between what's the difference between socialism and communism, you're basically saying there really is no difference. Like it seems like a lot of people will, instead of coming out and saying they're, especially nowadays in America, instead of being like I'm a communist, they'll just say I'm a socialist. That basically means the same thing. Is there any difference at all between the two? I never seem to get a clear answer on that.
Right. Well, okay. I'll answer this as straightforwardly as possible. In Marx's writing, there was no real difference between the two. Lenin did see them as different. He said that socialism was a stage between capitalism and communism, where the state was ruled by the dictatorship of the proletariat, and they laid the groundwork for communism. And so in Russia, they claim they were working towards communism. But also in the modern world, a lot of people use the word socialism to describe social democracy, which is like this like Bernie Sanders style reformism. And so I think the terms get confused a lot. Originally to Marx, it was the same thing as communism. Lenin made it this sort of weird authoritarian in-between system. And then in the modern day, a lot of people use it to mean Bernie Sanders. And so it depends who you're talking to. Does that answer your question?
Yes. And so so in terms of Marx, so Marx, okay, so first of all, Russia is kind of like an interesting example of a communist country, because it almost seems like they did, I think, right, go from communist and now they're pretty much fascist, right? I mean, it's like Putin's pretty much a fascist leader, right? Like where he
Yeah.
just took over Ukraine, and it's like, so it's kind of interesting how they went from communism to fascism, right? But a better question would be, um, yeah. So, oh yeah. So I was wondering. So in terms of like Russia and I guess China, it seems like you kind of had the leaders taking over the country and wanting to turn it into a communist country. That's correct, right? It wasn't so much the ground level. It wasn't so much like the peasants wanted it to become communist. It was more like the leaders turned it. It kind of makes it's kind of interesting to me that the leaders would actively want it to become communist because you think that they would almost want as much money and as much I guess you could say they probably did have power, but money and like capital and like goods
Mm.
as they could get. So you kind of almost wonder why would any leaders really want to go communist, right? But that is true, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It wasn't so much like a ground level revolt. It was more like Lenin, right, and Stalin kind of took over and decided to do it, right? What do you think they
Yeah,
were getting out
kind
of it?
of.
I guess.
I I think personally, I would say someone like Lenin, he was probably sincere about what and he probably genuinely wanted to make society better. No socialist wants to make everybody equally poor. They want to make people equally rich. Um, and so I'm
Supposedly, right? I mean,
supposedly, well, yeah, but I
yeah.
mean, my point is,
I mean, I
I'm
believe
sure,
you, but yeah,
yeah, I'm sure someone would disagree.
yeah,
But the point is, I'm sure he went into it with good intentions, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions and all that.
yeah,
And like communist socialists back in like the 1910s when the Russian Revolution happened, basically most of them were agreed that Russia couldn't be a communist country because the majority of people in Russia didn't support it. The majority of people were peasants, agricultural workers, not factory workers. And it tended to be sort of the factory workers in the cities in Russia that supported Lenin. And the peasants sort of had their own agenda separate from that. They wanted land reform. They wanted, to break up the bigger states so that they could have their plot of land. Um, and the first Russian Revolution, which I think was in February, saw this kind of democratic coalition between liberals and moderate socialists come to power. But they mismanaged the economy and ended up being very authoritarian in suppressing protests by like workers and peasants. And so they became very unpopular, and Lenin used that unpopularity as a chance to seize power for his own party and sort of take over the Russian republic that was being set up and make it a Bolshevik controlled republic by the Russian Communist Party. Um, and he's basically the gist of his idea was that you need to have a vanguard party. The Communist Party has to take power in these kinds of societies where they're not ready for a communist system, so that they can build the foundations for communism to emerge naturally. And that was a very, very bad idea, because when they took power in that way, I mean, obviously, power corrupts, and they did a lot of bad things and mismanaged the economy, and kind of it spiraled out of control. And at some point, they lost sight of the original goal, which was to create a free and democratic society. The goal they went into it with. Again, I think the reason was because they weren't ready for it. You could not have had a communist government in Russia come out of the Russian Revolution because society was not advanced enough for that to happen successfully. Whereas in the West, Karl Marx said in Britain, in England, socialism could be voted for democratically by the public because we're a much more industrialized, advanced, developed nation. He thought that the communist socialist movement had to fight for democracy and then use democracy to establish socialism peacefully. That was effectively what he felt the route to communism was. And I think it's very, very sad to see what happened in Russia. But all of the circumstances were working against them, if you like, including themselves.
yeah,
Does that kind of address your points? Does that make sense?
yeah. I mean, it's a lot. So it's like whenever I talk about this subject, I kind of feel like everything has to be kind of like boil down to simple points for me, because otherwise it's I'm not saying that you did a bad job explaining it, but you did a good job. But I try to like simplify everything as possible. But so basically, I definitely want to get into your, I don't want to get too far off the point before we get into your reasoning for socialism and what you want to do. But you got Karl Marx, who is from Germany, right? And
Yeah,
then
yeah,
his ideas kind of spread throughout the world into Russia, China, which I brought this up with the last person I was talking to about this, which was, for some reason I kind of feel like it's interesting that Russia got their ideas from somebody from Germany, and same with China got their ideas from somebody from Germany. Because you would almost think, at least the way that we look at Russia now and China, is they seem to be very kind of like they want to do their own thing. It doesn't seem like they're taking other people from the West ideas. But anyways, you got Karl Marx from Germany, very obviously smart guy who came up with the idea of communism. And then you got Lenin, who you mentioned, who was the leader of Russia and turned
yeah.
it into a communist country. But then you got Stalin, who kind of like enforced it, right? And it's like that's when things kind of got bad, right? I don't really know too much about any of it, but it sounds like Stalin was just this brutal fucking guy who just like went around and basically killed everyone who was opposing the communist belief, right? And
I mean, kind of. He killed a lot of people who agreed with communism as well. It's got to be said. Um, I mean,
why?
um,
Like, what? Why was he killing people who agreed with?
well, I mean, because they weren't the right kind of communist. You know, like he had executed some of the like leading lights of the Russian left wing intellectual movement, like uh, Gregory Zinoviev, uh, Plekhanov, I think. I can't remember all their names. Um, Evgeny Pashikanis, who was one of Russia's most prominent judges and wrote this sort of Marxist theory of the legal system. They were executed because Stalin's idea of communism was all about the state taking control, and the state represents the workers and the state controls everything and does things on behalf of the workers, whereas you had other communists who were more democratic and said no, communism has to be done by the people themselves. They have to choose it, which is more in line with what Karl Marx said. Karl Marx says the emancipation of the working class has to be done by the working class themselves. You can't force it on people. And sort of to boil it down to the basic elements, that was the main disagreement was between socialists back then was do you think that it has to be done in an authoritarian manner like Stalin, or do you actually trust people to come to that conclusion on their own? And do you think people should be given the choice? And I think people should be given the choice. And Stalin was completely wrong about what he did. I mean, he was an absolute monster. If you look at his policies, it's quite interesting. All of his policies, his economic policies, were about trying to industrialize Russia, to put it into the same position as, like modern industrial countries like Britain and America. And the reason he did that, I think, was because he realized that communism could not happen unless you had modern technology. And so he inherited Lenin, the Communist Party. They took power in a society that was not ready to be communist, and they used their power to try and make it ready. It was a complete disaster. And I think something very, very different would happen if you had a socialist movement in Britain or America. You wouldn't even need to have that debate. I don't think personally that what Stalin did was justified. But if a communist or socialist government took power in America, you wouldn't even need to have that debate, because America is already, or Britain is already, one of the world's most technologically advanced countries. You wouldn't need to resort to those means, even if you think it's justified. And I do not think it's justified. So I'm pleased about that. I think the world is in a much better state now than it was 100 years ago, and I think we're all better off for it.
Yeah. So, well, the thing is in terms of like whether or not it would work in America, I think kind of also goes to the fact that it's like enough people would want to have, like you were saying, enough people would want to have to do it. And the problem with America is I feel like you have half of the country who doesn't seem like they're very against it, right? Or maybe
Right,
even more
yeah.
than half the country. So it's like I don't know if it would work because you almost would have to have the majority of the people, I feel like,
Oh,
wanting to do it,
absolutely, yeah.
right?
Yeah, of course. But sorry, what I meant was technologically
Yeah,
able,
yeah.
like
Like
physically
you
able
mean
to do it.
you kind of mean in terms of computers being able to kind of like literally like cast out, like, you know, like what do you call it, like do like the and what's the word, like the computers would be able to kind of like figure out what everybody deserves or whatever, right? But back then it was
I
like
mean, kind
it
of,
would be,
kind of.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Like I guess the word would be like logistically you could do it with technology better than without. But so in
Yeah.
terms of was I right about Lenin being kind of like the leader of Russia at the time, but then you had
Yeah.
Stalin, who was more like the enforcer, kind of like probably the head of the military or something.
Well, Stalin took over after Lenin died, and there was like a power struggle between him and another man called Trotsky, um, over who would succeed Lenin. And Stalin won that, and Trotsky fled the country and spent the rest of his life criticizing Stalin for screwing everything up, until he was assassinated by Stalin. You know, like I said, Stalin killed a lot of communists. Because they thought, they knew that what he was doing, or they believed that what he was doing was completely the wrong approach.
Yeah, you can't. I think that it's like I think that you it's hard to kind of like force everybody into doing, and it's like
Yeah,
Putin to a certain extent is doing that now, right? Where if you don't go along with what he says, he'll have you killed. But in terms of like getting back to them ultimately wanting good, like you think that Lenin and Stalin ultimately wanted good, but it almost kind of like turned into bad. Like, but they're
well, I
but
mean, I
they're
don't know about Stalin. I mean, I'm much more cynical about Stalin than perhaps some other people. I don't
yeah.
necessarily think he was. I think he was quite a megalomaniac individual. I think Lenin was probably sincere. You know, he'd been around for a long time. He'd seen what Russia had been doing to people before the Communist Party took over. And it was a very, very brutal regime before the Communist Party took over. You know, the communists did improve a lot of things, um, but yeah, it was a noble idea that sort of ended in failure, and people have spent a long time, many years, and many books and documentaries have been dedicated to trying to work out why it failed. I can't answer that. I don't have all the answers. But I think it would have been more successful if they'd been more genuinely committed to the idea of democratic socialism. You know, you can't force these ideas on people. You can't force people to agree with it. You can't force them to go along with it. You have to give people the choice. And if you're not willing to do that, like with Stalin, I think it won't work.
Yeah, so getting into today, so democratic socialism would be more of everyone has to agree with this, or I guess the majority has to agree with the system, as opposed to just straight socialism or communism, which could potentially be just a take like a takeover. So getting into like today's world, like I kind of mentioned before, you have a lot of people who say, well, like okay, so just to explain where I'm coming from is like I'm someone who's ultimately for socialism. Socialism sounds better than communism, you know what I mean? So I'll just say socialism. Um, but I think a lot of people can say, well, that's because I don't have a lot of money. And it's like I don't really want to like go out and work 60 to 80 hours a week. I want to like basically work as little as possible and make enough money just to survive and then be free. Um, and you also have people saying, so like obviously you like somebody like you who I mean, I don't really obviously know. I'm not necessarily saying like I don't really know if you're wealthy, but if you're like you have a master's in law, somebody who's like going on to be like make a ton of money, but then they're socialists. It always kind of surprises me because like you would, like I was saying before, you would almost think that if you have a lot of money, you would kind of want to keep your money. But in terms of yeah, so today's system, um, when you advocate for socialism, and you get people saying, well, it doesn't work, it hasn't worked. You kind of mentioned why it didn't work in Russia, but well, first of all, what countries today would you say are socialist? Like we said, China, Russia. Well, Russia's not even socialist at this point, right? And China kind of is a mix of capitalism and socialism, right? So you don't really even have too many actual communist countries. But and yeah, I guess just in terms of the question of it hasn't worked, it doesn't work. What would you, I guess like now we'll just go into why you think socialism should work, but then you can also ask somebody like, if you think it's so good, like, would you want to go live in these places? I asked that guy who I had on before, like, would you want to live in China? Would you want to live in Cuba? And a lot like that's you know what I mean. But yeah, anyways, just yeah, and yeah, I know that's like a long-winded way of asking the question, but
Yeah,
basically, yeah, okay,
yeah. That's a really good question. I mean, no, I wouldn't want to live in China. I think it's a horribly corrupt, inefficient, and authoritarian system. Whatever I think about what socialism should be, um, that doesn't mean I agree with the policies of everybody who has tried to achieve socialism. I don't agree with the Soviet Union style of doing things. I don't agree with the Chinese system. I don't even agree with the way it's done in Cuba. And I wouldn't want to live in those countries. And I understand why nobody else would want to either. I mean, you know, they might have done some good things, but at a very high cost. Um, and you know, China, since the late 1970s, has been trying to make themselves into a hyper-westernized capitalist society because they know that you need to have a modern, advanced economy to achieve socialism. And so they've adopted this very, very free market, capitalistic sort of economic system to try and build up the wealth and the technology they need to implement socialism. But again, they've done it in a very authoritarian manner, like in Russia. And I think it's failed or is failing in China for the same reasons it failed in Russia. If you ask me what countries I think are socialist, I would say none. No country is socialist in the way that Marx saw it, which was this society based on common ownership and the sort of free access to goods and services, universal basic services. No country satisfies those criteria. You can argue till you're blue in the face about whether you think China or Cuba or wherever else are trying to be socialist, but whether they're trying or not, you have to recognize that they're failing, you know, that they so far they've not done a very good job of it. And we have to be honest about that. You know, there's no point in hiding the mistakes that these countries have made or saying, oh, isn't China wonderful? Isn't Cuba wonderful, brilliant, glorious paradise? They're not. They're not. You're not going to fool anybody by saying that they are. You know, what I'm more interested in about is what we do to move forward in the future instead of trying to defend people like Stalin who've been dead now for decades. I'm more interested in how do we make the world a better place instead of harking back to failed experiments. Do you get what I'm saying?
yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And when I ask that question, I'm not necessarily trying to disagree with you. It's more just kind of like I feel like that's an obvious rebuttal that they can take. And like I said, I'm for socialism, but at the same time, you obviously have to make it. You have to make sure it's going to work before you do it. So what's your idea of? I think you have a case for socialism or whatever. What is your idea going forward for it? Like,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the basic argument for socialism in the modern world in the 21st century is okay, well, first of all, you know, capitalism has served the world quite well for the past 200 years, whether that's British capitalism, American capitalism, or the sort of Chinese style capitalism. I am willing to accept, hands down, that it's made the world a better place. It's given us modern technology. You know, we have democratic constitutions in large parts of the world, modern medicine. So many good things have come out of it. And Karl Marx recognized that himself. You know, if you want to be a communist or a socialist, first you have to recognize that capitalism has been a necessary and important step for humanity. But, but there are still so many problems with the world, with poverty, with inequality. I think it's something like 2 million people die a year from workplace accidents, according to the International Labour Organization. Tens of thousands of people die from hunger, homelessness. I think, according to statistics published in 2015, almost half the population of the entire planet lives on less than $5.50 a day. That's outrageous inequality in a world that is so wealthy. And the great sort of paradox of capitalism is that it has given us the technology, the wealth, the industry to solve these problems, but it can't solve these problems because capitalism is motivated by the profit motive, the need to make money. And so if people can't afford food, they starve. If people can't afford houses, they sleep on the streets. We have everything we need to solve these social problems, and yet we can't, because it is not in the economic interests of the private corporations that own the technology, the wealth, and the resources. Now, if you lived in a socialist society where technology and resources were owned by the whole of humanity, and this is very important, not by the state, but by the entire population of the planet, the common heritage of mankind. If these things were socially owned, then we could use the technology we have to make sure that people were fed, clothed, housed, and, given a fair chance at life to prosper, to succeed, to flourish as individuals. That is the basic argument for socialism. Use the wealth we have created as a society to meet people's needs instead of to make the wealthy even wealthier.
Yeah, and it's like I totally agree, and I don't really see. Can you hear me? Okay, yeah. I totally agree, and I don't really see like why there's any like rebuttal to that. And it's like I was talking to a guy from Canada who was also actually a lawyer and a writer, and he seemed like a very smart guy. And I was asking him this question about, I guess, just government policies in America and stuff. And he's like, the rest of the world looks at America and we're like, why do you guys have so many problems? Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, you have so much. I think the point is you have so much fucking money, yet you're still doing this like hardcore like workhorse mentality. Like, you have Elon Musk, who's worth what, 200 billion, Jeff Bezos worth 200 billion, but then you have people who are poor sleeping on the streets. And it's like we can't even get to the point where we have socialized healthcare. It's like, and it doesn't even seem like that's something that like people are really pushing for. And then it's like, and I'm kind of wondering, like, is there something, like, to me it's just obvious, like, share the wealth, whatever, but like, is there something to the why, like, is America at this point so powerful and so robust or whatever, that there really is something to that, like, kind of like gnarly like workhorse method that people don't want to give up? Maybe like people are afraid, if we go socialist, are people just gonna, I think that's the biggest complaint, is like you can't just be giving away free money. And I don't think people really fully understand, because the other guy I was talking to, who was a communist, was saying it's not like you're just giving away free money. Like, people still have to work, but like you said, you have to work according to your um what's the
Each
word?
according to your ability, from each according to
Exactly.
their ability to each according to their need. Yeah.
So I think that means kind of like, if your ability is to do much more, then I guess you'll be working more, but also making more. That was another thing he told me too, is I thought that everybody would like essentially make the same amount of money, like doctors would make the same amount of money as like clerks. But he was kind of saying no, that he was kind of saying that that's not the case. Like, doctors still would make more money than, like, say,
I,
clerks or whatever.
I mean, in socialism, as Karl Marx saw it, you wouldn't have money. You wouldn't need money because money is a medium of exchange.
So then how would
Um,
it work? Like, how
yeah,
would I
that's
buy something?
that's the million-dollar question. I mean, the whole point is of socialism is you have these advanced technologies. You don't need to exchange things. The whole point of from each according to their ability to each according to their needs means if you need something like a house or clothes, or well, the house is a bad example, but clothes or food, you can go into a shop and will be will be able to receive clothes or food or whatever else you need. It is a system without money because fundamentally things are made, production is done to meet human needs, not for buying and selling. In a socialist society, you don't need to buy and sell things. The system is designed and people work to make sure that all of our human needs are satisfied. And in a society where people cooperate to achieve this goal with the modern technology we have, it's perfectly feasible. That there is so much, there is such a wealth of resources on this planet that the idea of scarcity is something that either is or soon can be a thing of the past. If you put the right laws in place and had the right systems in place, you would not need to be buying and selling things because the things you need to survive would not be scarce. That's the sort of basic idea of it. You do what you can to contribute to your community, and you take what you need from the community. That's the essential idea of it.
Well, in terms of the logistics of how it works, if there's no money, and like I don't really have money or need money to buy anything, do you think that everybody would work legitimately to get what everybody needs? But I think another problem would be like, would you have people who are just kind of like being lazy intentionally because they know, well, we're all sharing everything anyways? Do you think that's a
Yeah,
problem? Is how would you
it's
fix that?
that's a common criticism, and it's a fair point. It's a fair argument, um, a fair concern that people have. The answer to it is yes, people would still work for a number of reasons. First of all, generally people don't like doing nothing. If somebody doesn't work, there's usually a reason for it. For example, disability. People feel bored and restless when they have nothing to do. And so naturally, you would still find people want to go out and do things to help their communities. It gives you a buzz. It makes you feel good. You feel like you're part of a community. Humanity has been a social animal for its entire existence. We are still animals. We do still have that biological imprint that says, go out and help your fellow man. That hasn't gone away. It's been watered down because we're living in a system which forces us to compete with each other. But if you remove the things that stop us from helping each other, namely capitalism, then yeah, people would still work to make sure that everybody has what they need. But again, the other point is, um, under a socialist society with modern technology, you wouldn't have to work, I don't know, 5 days a week. You wouldn't have to work 50 hours a week just to scrape by on minimum wage. With the technology we have, you could reduce the working week to 4 days, to 3 days, to 2 days, whatever. Obviously you'd have to do studies into it, feasibility studies. But certainly with the technology we've got, the amount of people there are on the planet, we could all be working far, far less and have far much more wealth in our lives than we currently do. Now, if you go to somebody and say, do you want to keep working 50, 60-hour weeks for the rest of your life and have nothing to show for it? Or do you want to work 2 days a week and live a decent, dignified life? 9 out of 10 people would take that deal. So no, I don't think the sort of coattail problem with these sort of lazy hangers-on, it's not a real concern. There are things you can do to solve it, to mitigate it, to make sure it doesn't happen. And what I find really interesting is, when are we going to start talking about the loafers under capitalism? People like Jeff Bezos, people like Elon Musk, who do absolutely nothing to contribute to society and hoard all the wealth for themselves. They're the real lazy loafers, and we need to do something about them. So yeah, that's
Yeah,
my view
yeah.
on it.
I agree. even though I'm not a huge fan of Elon Musk, I probably wouldn't say that he's not doing anything to contribute to society. Because from what I've heard, he is like a workaholic. But I see your point. I mean, you might disagree with that in terms of he's doing like bad to help society, but I think there's a lot of owners of companies who really aren't doing, nearly as much work as the low man on the totem pole,
Well,
right?
yeah, the point is everything we have in
Yeah,
society, from those books on the shelf behind me, right down to the Empire State Building, everything that exists in the world exists because somebody built or made it, right? And I don't see Elon Musk, laying bricks and mortar. I don't see him plowing a field. I don't see him working in a steel factory. Sure,
yeah,
he works hard for himself, but all of his wealth, all of his money comes from the people working in, SpaceX, working on the factory line at Tesla, making those cars, which he sells for a profit. And, the basic idea of socialism is the people who make those cars, they should get the benefits from that instead of the profits going to some CEO who, contributes very little to the business and takes all the profits. Labor is the source of value. The people that do the labor are entitled to the benefits of it.
yeah. No, I totally agree. I mean, somebody's got to roll up their sleeves and
Yeah,
do the
yeah.
dirty
And,
work,
and
and
with,
it's
with
not the
all due,
top guy.
oh, sorry.
No problem.
Sorry, after you.
Oh no, no,
Oh, okay.
I think I finished. It's not the top guy who's rolling up their sleeves and doing the grunt work.
Right,
It's the
yeah.
bottom guy. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Exactly, yeah. And the great irony of capitalism is the people who work the hardest get the least, Some poor sod
yeah.
building cars, riveting whatever for Elon Musk. He's gonna earn a tiny fraction of the money that Elon Musk does from pushing a pen around a desk all day. I'm sorry, you
Yeah.
can't convince me that Elon Musk works harder than the people who work for him do. It's an absolute nonsense.
Yeah, well, I think that question is always hard for me to kind of like. I kind of agree, I agree with you, and I feel that way. But it's like I never really fully know what the owner of the company is doing, so it's like they kind of get away with probably not working very hard because you never really see them. They're never really even there for the most part. But
Yeah, right.
yeah, in terms of like people working hard, it's like or like having that kind of like if you don't work, you kind of start to get like fidgety and like cabin fever if you stay at home all day. And that's the thing is with me is it's like I like to work. Like right, I told you before in the email I'm doing like the gig economy type thing. And like you were kind of like, oh, that's brutal. And I was like, no, actually, I actually like it more because like I'm kind of like on my own time. I'm my own boss. Like nobody's really like breathing down my neck. And I'd say at some point, like I'm not like the hardest worker, but I'll sleep it and stuff like that. But like I'll get up and I gotta get out of the fucking house and I have no problem doing that work. What I have a problem with is like when you work in the Amazon warehouse or somewhere like that, and they're literally like tracking your day for 10 hours a day or more, making sure that you're constantly doing something. I just cannot stand that. Um, yeah. So, and in terms of logistically of how socialism or communism would work in terms of like, would everybody essentially have kind of like the same amount of money and like everybody would almost have like a similar house, like a similar car, like a similar everything, similar, like would it all be essentially pretty much equal, like in terms of money, or I guess there really is no money, but in terms of goods,
In
like you would
terms
all
of
have the same
wealth,
amount
yeah.
of, yeah.
That's a really good question. Well, it wouldn't be like standardized like that. I mean, if everybody wants the same house, sure, go for it. But the basic, once you have a socialist system where you're all working less with modern technology, with automation, like working shorter hours to produce the same amount of goods, what you would find is goods of a much higher quality with much more variance. Instead of having to work in a factory where you pump out the same standardized, I don't know, whatever kitchen appliances, toasters, electric kettles, um, the same, standardized shirts made in sweatshops in the Philippines. Instead of that, you would see much more craft produced goods, much more artisanal goods. You would have the time to really, really pour your heart and soul into the work you're doing to make goods that would be unique and that would appeal to people beyond this sort of standardized capitalist consumerism. So I actually think you'd have much better quality goods than you do currently. In terms of whether everybody would have the same, well, that depends on taste. You know, if you want a vase, go out and get a vase. If you want something else, go out and get that. If you want the same as what everybody else has, then go for it. But it's a non-coercive system where you're not forced to compete with other people. You can go out and create whatever you want to create, and that can be yours. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. It's like everybody would have the same amount of or similar amount of wealth, but it doesn't necessarily mean you would have the exact same house or exact same cars or
It's
whatever.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think a better way of thinking about it, instead of everybody has the same amount, it's more that everybody has the same access to resources. So if you
Yeah.
think of everything in, you know, the production, the system of production, all the goods and resources and um, wealth and technology of society, you have an equal right to use the technology to build what you want to build for yourself autonomously without some boss breathing down your neck. I mean, you know, obviously in economies of scale, you still need rules to coordinate, but it's a much more democratic, much less coercive way of organizing wealth. And so it's not everybody has the same thing. It's everybody has the same right to access the things they want or need. Does that make sense?
Yeah. In terms of communism, it seems like everybody is kind of like entitled to the goods. It's like this, like like this lamp or this iPhone or this computer or whatever isn't necessarily mine. In terms of just kind of like a more overall kind of like copyright type mentality, do you kind of believe that everybody is kind of entitled to everything? We've created this kind of these laws that say, okay, like you worked this hard or your parents worked this hard or their parents worked this hard, and at some point they were using slaves, and so now you have all this money, so this is all yours, nobody can take this away from you. But it's all kind of like man-made laws. Do you feel like inherently we're all kind of like entitled, but as animals don't have that. Animal, like you said, we're animals. When animals are in the forest, everything is everything in the forest is for each individual animal. It's not like one animal is like, that's my tree and you can't have that. Do you feel like in terms of copyright law, not only copyright law but any type of
The law of property.
exactly, property law really shouldn't even exist, kind of?
Well, good question. I mean, socialism, communism, it doesn't mean you can just walk into somebody else's house and take whatever you want. I mean, insofar as property laws protect the individual's right to the things they own, that's not incompatible with communism. That is, you know, part of being an individual. Nobody can come and steal your stuff. Um, what it's about in terms of property law is about who owns the resources, the technology, the factories, the tools, right? And so what communists or socialists want to make the property of everybody is not, you know, individual goods. It is the tools we use to make goods. So industrial and commercial land, factory equipment, industrial machinery, these kinds of things, transportation networks, these are what would be cooperatively owned in a socialist society or a communist society, not, you know, your prized collection of video games or whatever hobbies you have. Those would still be your property. They belong to you. What you can't do is say, I own a factory. Everybody who works in the factory has to give me everything they make, and then I'll take all the money and they can have minimum wage. You know,
Yeah.
because that's it's about getting rid of that sort of exploitative relationship whereby a tiny group of people have monopolized the well, it's like that other guy you were talking to said, the means of production, the things we need to create wealth belong to everybody instead of being monopolized by a small group of individuals.
Yeah, well, in terms of coming up with other ideas as opposed to just straight socialism or straight communism, it seems like you could keep capitalism, but be like, okay, capitalism is still a thing. However, the guy at the top can't make $1 million a year, and the guy at the bottom can't make $5 an hour or whatever, or $10 an hour. It's got to be more combined. So basically, just raising the minimum wage. But then when you raise the minimum wage, a lot of people will complain about like if you raise the minimum wage, then the owner of the company is just going to like charge more, which is kind of like seemingly what's going on now with like the inflation. But to move on real quick, I want in terms of the copyright thing. Do you know who like Hassan Piker is? Like, do you listen to any of like the modern socialists on the internet or whatever?
I've heard of him, but I don't really know who he is. The name rings a bell.
Yeah, so this is kind of like a personal question because I post a lot to YouTube and I'm trying to get monetized and all this stuff. In terms of intellectual property, him and his co-host on this podcast H3 were talking about it, and his co-host was saying this one YouTuber was basically just like kind of like ripping off, because I don't know if you know about like you copyright law or how YouTube works, but you can basically use somebody else's video as long as like you're reacting to it. But he had a problem with this guy because the guy wasn't really reacting to the video. Like he was watching a video of something else, but he wasn't really saying anything. He was just kind of like he would even like get up and leave and walk away. And then Hassan Piker was like saying how intellectual property isn't like it's not like there's not only a certain amount of intellectual property on YouTube. Like there's an unlimited amount. You can just keep making copies. It's not like food or in terms of intellectual property, you being a lawyer, I don't know how much you know about copyright law, but do you feel like intellectual property should really be able to be shared? Like, should I be able to just like take someone else's video and does that make sense? Because I kind of feel like we live in this society that's like, and it kind of makes sense why there are these rules. Like you were saying, you can't just go into somebody's house and rip them off because they might shoot you or you might shoot them. There's going to be violence or something, right? And that's probably a big reason to not do it and for the law. But in terms of intellectual property, I feel like our society is built kind of on this is mine and you can't use the it's kind of almost like child games, you know what I mean? Where it's like, when children, it's like, okay, Johnny, like you have to share your item with the other person. Nobody really wants to fucking share anything. It's like you try and use like a little like musical clip on your YouTube page, and it's like boom, 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 like copyright, universal or whatever. So, anyways, my question to boil it down would be like in terms of intellectual property, do you feel like we should be able to share that? But then the question is like if people do share their intellectual property, does that mean anybody can just take Joe Rogan's video or this song or that song and like post it? Like, what do you think about that type of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, good question. I I think the question of what to do with intellectual property, it's an interesting question, but I think it's a different question from should we be socialist? Because, like, in terms of fair use of people's videos and artistic creations and so on, I think you can support strong copyright laws and be a socialist, or you can support weak copyright laws and be a socialist. I mean, my own opinion is I think people should be credited for the things they create. And so I do support copyright laws. And there's nothing about socialism that's opposed to that. The idea that if you create something, you should be recognized as the person who created it. I think that's a perfectly natural human instinct. Where socialists do criticize intellectual property laws, it relates to really, really important human rights or human needs, like patents for cures for diseases and vaccines and things like that. Those intellectual property laws, which allow massive corporations to hold society hostage, would have to go. That is completely incompatible with socialism. But in terms of like your individual artistic creations, I think those should still be protected, provided you know there are exceptions for like fair use, commentary, criticism, and so on. That's my own opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it really does make sense. But it's like if I take time to make something like this video, for instance, nobody's probably gonna want to rip off any of my videos. But it's like, um, if I take the time to make this video and I build this channel and I build this podcast, and then somebody comes along and just rips it and makes money off it, like that's obviously not fair. But in terms of just like kind of getting into like more of like a philosophical type thing, in terms of laws in general, like I've heard before that like I said before, like laws are man-made. Somebody made the laws, and I've heard that like laws are kind of like laws have been created by the rich to protect the rich. And do you feel like that's pretty true? Like, do you kind of almost feel like even laws like stealing and stuff like that from Walmart, like, I mean, once again, it's like Walmart does, do the job of like having their store, and like they have to get their items and they have to make a certain amount of money. But do you feel like you can kind of almost from a philosophical standpoint kind of like justify a lot of like basically breaking a lot of laws? But it's like who the fuck made this law? You know what I mean? It's like, or like the abortion law. Like if your state has no abortion and you're like, I need a fucking abortion or whatever it is,
Yeah,
right? I mean, do you feel like laws to
yeah.
a certain are almost like made to be broken? Like it's like not made to be broken, but like,
So when I first started studying law, I was very naive. I was a big supporter of law and the legal system, and I thought, yeah, this is all about justice and fairness and so on and so forth. But the more I studied it, you know, this is part of why I have the political views I do, is because the more I studied law, the more I realized that law is biased against the little man and the underdog and the individual, and in favor of states and massive corporations and the wealthy. It's rigged against you right from the start, you know. And so, yeah, I mean, I think laws definitely do benefit the rich. Politicians make laws to benefit the rich because you know the wealthy people are very good at convincing politicians to pass the laws they want. In terms of whether you should break the law, there are times, absolutely, when you should break the law. If you lived in Nazi Germany, yeah, you should be a member of the resistance. You should go out and protest against the government or whatever. People in dictatorships have every right to overthrow the government. Um, sure, yeah, I agree with that. Protest, you know, you look at our history and all the important rights we take for granted, we have because people were willing to go out and break the law to achieve them. You know, in this country, for example, in Britain, working class people only got the vote after decades of protests and riots and things like that. Yeah, of course you have to break the law if you want to live in a fair and just society, provided you're not like harming people. Um, Whether I would break the law, I don't know. It depends on the context. I'd like to think if I was living in Nazi Germany, I'd be more than happy to break the law. But I'm not going to go out and smash someone's head in because I disagree with them. It really depends on what kind of laws you're talking about. Do you know what I mean?
yeah, no, I know. And it's like I was raised like, Christian, and it's like went to church, and like, I've always like been one to follow the law and like don't lie and all that. But like the older I get, the more I like realize, oh, like a lot of other people, a lot of wealthy people like Elon Musk, and I mean, I don't know if I don't really have any examples of Elon Musk breaking the law, but you hear these guys who get to the top like really are breaking the laws. That's kind of like how they got to that point, is because they're like
Oh yeah, absolutely.
some of them are even like just total like sociopaths or whatever. And
Mm.
I mean,
I have
I
to
don't
say,
know.
I'm pretty sure Elon Musk has violated like labor laws in terms of unfairly dismissing workers and trying to stop them from organizing trade unions. You know, if it
Yeah.
benefits the wealthy, they will break the law. There are countless examples of it. You know, look at things like Blair Mountain in America, where the coal companies, you know, beat and killed and murdered striking coal miners to protect their profit margins. Um, Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you on that. And but at the same time, you have to remember that the law is definitely made to benefit the people with power in our society. Um, Very often they don't have to break the law. The law says that Elon Musk is allowed to exploit his workers. The law says that he's allowed to take all the profits from his company when actually it's the people working for him who have created that wealth. The law says that you're allowed to act in all sorts of unfair, immoral, or negative ways, provided you do everything by the book. So yeah, on the one hand, the wealthy will break the law if it benefits them, but on the other hand, they have a legal system that benefits them. It's kind of a bit of a false dichotomy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm just kind of like surprised that so many of the bottom people like just seem to like put up with it. It's like just now, like here in United States, like they're supposedly starting to do labor unions for, like you mentioned, Starbucks and Amazon and stuff. But it's just like it's just sad that so many people at the bottom just put up with it. I think that I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that like not many people are at Starbucks for very long, or Amazon. It's like you're only there for like a year or so, so it's probably hard to get something going. Whereas the people in Hollywood who are striking right now have been there for forever. So to get to another like philosophical question, I don't know how much you know about like idealism and materialism, but the communist guy I had on the podcast said that communists have a particular belief in terms of philosophic philosophically idealism. Do you know about those two terms?
Yeah, absolutely. I know exactly what he's talking about. Do you mind if we take like a 3 minute break, so I can get myself another glass of water?
Yeah, no problem.
I'll be back in a moment then. Cheers.
Okay, cheers. All right, yeah. So just to preface the question of idealism versus materialism, I had a guy on from Saudi Arabia actually, and he was the first guy to like kind of explain the two to me, and I had never even really heard of either of them. Maybe materialism and not idealism. And most people here in America don't even really know what they are. So if I guess real quick, I'll just say idealism is where you believe like we're living in consciousness, kind of, right? So everything you see, like this isn't necessarily this death isn't necessarily material. It's just kind of a conscious state, I guess, that we're like seeing. Whereas materialism would be that this is actually really here, correct? And we're seeing it with
Kind
our
of.
brain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Or
mean,
how would you explain it?
idealism and materialism is like one of the oldest philosophical debates, certainly in Western philosophy, right the way back to Plato. In a nutshell, kind of as you say, an idealist would say that our thoughts, our mind exists independently of the physical world. Whereas a materialist would say, well, it's kind of about which one you put emphasis on. An idealist would say that our minds exist independently of the physical world, and that we can only perceive the world through our mind, through our thoughts, which colors, everything we perceive, like, as you say, a state of consciousness. Whereas materialists say that the world exists independently of our thoughts, and then we perceive the world to exist, but there is an objective world which exists outside of our perceptions of it. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. And
Yeah, but
what do you believe?
specifically, well, I mean, in terms of the philosophical debate, I don't know. I think the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. But in terms of like the whole question about socialism, idealism versus materialism carries a special significance. Um, and it sort of relates to this: how do you view the activities of human beings? What are our motivations? And to put the point very briefly, socialism is a materialist ideology because it says that in a fundamental way, people are motivated by material factors: the need to eat, the need for water, the need for shelter, that our human needs and desires are what motivates our actions. and our beliefs about the world are a product of those material needs. Whereas an idealist would say, for example, that we became a liberal democracy because liberal democracy is a great idea and people believed in it. A socialist would say we became a liberal democracy because it benefited a certain class of people to become a liberal democracy. So it's really the distinction about how you view social evolution. Do you think our beliefs are a product of our evaluation of ideas, or do you think they're a product of like material circumstances?
Yeah, I would. Are you asking me or?
No, I'm
Oh
saying
yeah,
sorry.
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
saying
yeah,
that's
yeah,
kind
yeah.
of the difference between the materialist and the idealist.
Yeah,
Um,
I would almost think that it would be the reverse. I would almost think that socialists would be idealists more for the fact that if it's if this isn't really like materially here, then why would it like really kind of like belong to anyone? If that makes sense, like everything we're kind of like
yeah.
living it. Like I don't know, like for some reason I thought it would be the other way around, but yeah.
Well, it's kind of like it's because of like it derives from or is part of like the Marxist belief in class conflict. So generally, and again, I'm simplifying the concepts here, but like as a rule of thumb, the Marxist belief is that working class people generally tend to support socialist ideas because it is beneficial to them to do so. Because if you have nothing, a socialist system that promises equality will be advantageous to you. And you believe it's the right thing to do. You believe it's just because, from your perspective, the way you perceive the world, working in a factory, being commanded about or ordered about and suffering exploitation, the idea of socialism seems like a pretty fair system to you. Whereas if you're a billionaire, um, and you have thousands of people working for you, you probably think that capitalism is a fair system because you earned your place, pulled yourself up by the bootstraps, or you're a job creator or whatever. So it's kind of about the class system and the Marxist belief. The Marxist belief is that the views we have are a product of our experiences of the real material world.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything really more to say about that. And even if there is, it would probably just take too long to go into the whole like philosophical,
Yeah.
reasoning behind the two. But so in terms, and we'll wrap it up here. I'll ask you a couple more questions, and then because I know you
Oh,
want to
go
do like an
for it,
hour
go
and a half.
for it.
So in terms of a real problem that we're seeing supposedly within the next 10 years or whatever, and even Andrew Yang kind of, I don't know if you know about him at all, but he came out with like UBI for because of like robots taking over and AI taking over, which probably won't happen for another 10 years or so. But do you see that actually becoming like a real issue? I've even heard Sam Altman of Open AI, he created Chat GPT, saying that he thinks that this AI will essentially kind of take over capitalism. And I guess the robots, AI, whatever, will be doing the jobs instead of the people. So do you see that becoming an issue within the next 10 years or so, or when? And then also yeah, I guess you see that becoming not even really so much of an issue, but I think that it's actually kind of like a good thing. I think it kind of like will almost force socialism, right?
Yeah, kind of. And there are some people who say that socialism is inevitable because of this. I don't know if I believe that, but in general, the problem is the question is who owns the machines, the billionaires or the people? Are we going to allow these technologies to make us poorer, to chisel down our working conditions, our pay, our hours? Are we going to let machines take over workers' jobs to benefit the people that run the companies? Or are we going to use these machines to give us all a pay rise and an extra day off? That's really the question. AI automation, it's coming one way or the other, and it can only be a good thing for humanity. The question we need to answer is who's it going to belong to? Is it going to belong to society or is it going to belong to the billionaire class?
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with you. I think it will be a good thing for society, but some people think that it also may not be a good thing for society. I'm
Well,
kind of
that's
looking
because
forward
they're
to it,
blaming
but
the technology instead of the system.
yeah.
Technology is not the problem. It's the laws that allow the technology to be used to exploit us.
Well, some of them do think that the technology may get so advanced to where it like just kills us off, kind of thing. You know what I mean?
Well, maybe.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
But
I
so
don't
so
know.
in terms of the laws, well, first of all, I kind of feel like they're gonna have. I think like literally just read that Newsom, the governor of California, got something put on his desk about either like allowing or not allowing autonomous like semi trucks to be driven to. So I mean, at some point, I feel like they're gonna have to make a decision. Like, are we going to even allow this to happen? Because it's like we can't. I would say we can't just take everyone's jobs away from them unless we can essentially give them money still, right? So I feel like the government will kind of be forced to give the people money, like you were saying, like instead of like just giving all the money to the tech companies, like they're gonna have to do something for the people. And I don't know, for one am looking forward to robots taking over my job, but
Yeah,
you know what I
absolutely.
mean. But it's like you said, hopefully they'll do the right thing in terms of the laws.
Yeah, but then we need a strong labor movement to make sure it goes the right way. It has to be people power um, that forces them to do it because they're not going to do it on their own. The corporations want the profits and are going to be lobbying for it. So you have to make sure there's a strong movement there to oppose it. But that's really interesting about like automated trucks and stuff. Like if road haulage was owned by the Teamsters Union, then they could replace all the trucks with self-driving trucks, provided they're safe, and give all the Teamsters, a paid vacation. The problem is the fact that road haulage is privatized in America and in a lot of countries. And so the workers that drive the trucks, they don't get any of the profits.
Yeah, yeah. So in terms of so yeah, you also mentioned like when I told you I did like the gig economy, you mentioned that you heard that California was like watering down the rights of the
I heard
workers.
that, yeah.
By watering down, do you mean they're making them worse for the workers or better?
Worse. Is that correct? I mean,
Well,
I've heard something about it.
it seems kind of weird because well, California for one is like a liberal. It's like one of them, if not the most liberal state in the United States. So, and a little while back, I heard that like in terms of the gig economy, I think what they were trying to do was they were trying to make it so companies like Uber, any of the basically gig companies, they were like forced to give health insurance, and it had to be like more of like a full-time kind of job. So I think if they were trying, from what I know, they were trying to make it better for the workers, but then some of the workers were complaining because they were saying, hey, like I like being able to do this as is, and the company won't even be able to do it if they turn it into a full. Part of the reason why Uber is able to do what they're doing is because they're not paying. Well, I'm assuming they're paying taxes, but like they're not having to give everybody. It's not like a full time job in terms of they're giving you all the benefits and everything. So I don't really know. It seems like it would be kind of weird if they were watering down the rights. I feel like California would be doing the opposite.
I must
But
have just heard it wrong in that case.
some people were like I said, some people were complaining about it. I don't know what you're referring to exactly, but in terms of we kind of were starting to talk about politics in the beginning in terms of English politics, American politics. How are you viewing American politics currently?
Right.
Like from an outsider, are you looking in kind of being like, what the fuck is going on there? Like, you know what I mean? Like,
Kind of, yeah. I mean, I can't say that Britain is much better at the moment. I think the problem, well, there's two problems with American politics. One is that organized labor has never had its own political party. Like in every country in Europe, there's been like a separate political party dedicated to promoting the interests of the working class. Sometimes they've done a bad job of it, but at least they're there. whereas America's never had that. The working class have always sort of supported the Democrats. The labor unions have always supported the Democrats, but they've never really gotten that much in return for it because the Democrats are not a working class political party. They're an elitist political party, just like the Republicans. So that's one of the biggest problems with America. You've really got to set up your own independent Labour Party. And the other problem with American politics is the same problem that every other country in the Western world has, which is this fact that since, Thatcher and Reagan and all that, the left wing of politics has really been completely out of ideas and totally on the retreat. And I think in America, you have an especially nasty case of it where, you know, formerly left wing working class union voters have been voting for people like Donald Trump because elitist politicians like Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and all that simply don't give a any concern whatsoever for the lives of ordinary people, and so they've been forced into the arms of these sort of right-wing populist figures like Trump because the Democrats completely abandoned them. And you see similar things in every other Western country. So in that sense, I don't think America's got it any worse. But I do think American politics is pretty badly traveling in the wrong direction, and it's worrying for the rest of the world because you guys are one of the leading military powers, and who knows what you'll do with that.
Yeah, it's weird because you hear a lot of people saying stuff like, "Oh, like we're crumbling as a nation, and like there's going to be a civil war and all this shit." Like, I don't really buy into all of it. I think it's all kind of bullshit. I I mean, don't get me wrong. I agree with what you're saying in terms of, I don't know. It's gotten weird here. Like it's mainly just like so polarized. But in terms of like the future of our country, I think we'll be fine. And same with you. I don't see us like falling as a nation or anything. In terms of
I'd
the
be surprised. Yeah,
what?
I'd be surprised if it happened.
Yeah, I mean, obviously things could keep getting worse, but I kind of feel like a lot of the polarization and kind of like the extremes, it's just kind of like to a certain extent like bullshit. It's just kind of like, yeah, like you have a lot of people out there who are like angry, and it's not bullshit that people are angry and pissed off, but it's like it almost seems kind of like they're especially the right is kind of like what's the word, like they're just kind of bluffing in terms of like I mean, Trump's been indicted 4 times now, and like he may or may not go to prison, and they're all pissed off, and it's like, dude, the guy deserves it. In terms of the election coming up, what do you think will happen? Do you see? I mean, what's your guess?
I don't know if someone put a gun to my head and said you have to guess the outcome. At this point, I'd say probably the Democrats will hold the White House. But I think it's too early to tell. It'll depend on a lot of things like does Donald Trump actually go to jail? Who do the Republicans put up? Will the Democratic platform be left wing enough to inspire young people to actually care about it? But in the long term, I really do think that, or I hope that you guys can sort of move away from this two-party system. I think the biggest problem with America is these sort of blue no matter who voters who will happily vote for the worst, most appalling right-wing candidates, so long as they're running as a Democrat instead of a Republican. If you want things to get better, you have to vote for people who actually want to make things better. And if you want a more socialist society, you have to vote for a working class political party that cares about the working class and isn't completely out of touch like the Democrats are.
Yeah, it's funny because you mentioned that you guys had the Labor Party movement. I don't even think that I even knew that. Like
Right, yeah. So
because it's like for whatever reason, it seems like the rest of the world knows a lot about American politics, but American people don't necessarily, like I don't really know too much about what's going on in English politics. So it's like if you were to talk about it, I don't even really know who you're talking about. So I think I would just be
right,
lost.
yeah.
But yeah.
I think a lot of American politics gets into the news over here because it's a topic that people are interested in and we talk about it and sort of
Yeah.
follow it. like the BBC always reports on what's happening in America and stuff like that. But yeah, like a hundred years ago, roughly 100 years ago, or 120 years ago, the two main parties in Britain were the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party, and they were a Conservative Party and a Liberal Party. But people felt, working class people, poor people felt that the Liberal Party was not representing their interests. And so they went out and founded the Labour Party, which was all about getting trade unions, organized labor into politics. And at first, they only had like two members of parliament. Parliament is like, members of Congress. So they only had two MPs at first, but they spent, a couple of decades building it up until the Labour Party was like one of the two parties and completely replaced the Liberal Party. And instead of representing sort of these elitist, middle class, industrialist interests like the old Liberal Party had, they represented the working class interests. And similar things in the rest of Europe. And, that's why we have universal health care and better social security and stuff, is because in Europe, working class people actually went out and made their own political movement to challenge the established parties. And I think that's what you guys need over there.
Yeah, and when talking about like socialists, we were kind of saying which countries are socialist. It seems like from what I've heard, it seems like France isn't socialist, but like they seem to be like really liberal. But then you also have like Norway and Sweden, and those places are supposedly really almost socialist, right? Aren't isn't like the Scandinavian countries?
Yeah, I mean, they have quite a high level of welfare. I'd say they're not socialist, but the welfare and stuff they have exists because of political pressure from socialists. And it was only like campaigns by socialist and working class politicians that got those things in the first place. And, same in Britain with like the National Health Service. Um, you can't underestimate the importance of having what really working class, genuinely working class people in politics. Um, like I think one of the biggest reasons France is the way it is because they have had, sorry, in the past, a massive socialist and communist political parties. The Socialist Party and the Communist Party were very, very popular in France, and they were willing to go out and strike and protest and even riot to make sure that the government actually listened to them and acted in their best interests. And that's that you just don't see the same thing anymore in places like America or Britain, and that's why we've sort of diverged.
Yeah, I wonder why America. I mean, I guess it's just because, yeah, you kind of wonder why America hasn't adopted more of that. It's like I think it kind of goes back to the whole like I think you know I don't know. Like I was gonna say, people like believe in the hard work or whatever, which isn't a bad principle. You know what I mean? But it's also I think that we're like kind of like the like one of the youngest nations, right? And I think that probably has a lot to do with why we're so robust. I guess you know what I mean. And like I don't know. I don't know.
Maybe
Yeah.
I don't know. I think there's so many different factors you could look at. I mean, I'm not a historian, but I think yeah, I think maybe you're onto something there. But this whole thing about the work ethic stuff, and I think having a good work ethic is important as an individual, but people don't like to realize that they're being robbed blind by corporations because it's not an easy thing to admit. And even, there's a lot
I
of people out
agree.
there
Yeah.
who, yeah. But even the people who do recognize it, they say, well, what can we do about it? I'm just an individual. I can't change the world. There's a lot of cynicism and a lot of complacency. I think it's really all about making people realize that there are different ways of doing business. And, you can have a say in politics. You can get involved. You can build your own movement if you're willing to put the work in to do that.
Yeah.
I think as socialists, we have to show people that we are serious and that we do have a practical alternative and that it's not going to fail like it did in Russia. and you have to address those concerns and show people how it's going to work and say, this is how we're going to achieve it. Clear goals, you know. You got to
Yeah.
show them that.
Yeah, I feel like the people at the top like do a really good job at kind of like getting together and being like, okay, how are we gonna like set this up to where basically it works for us. But the people at the bottom, I think that it's like a lot of times they're not organized, and there's a lot of them, but they're not organized enough. And like I was saying before, like at places like Amazon and Starbucks, they're not even there that long. So it's like they don't really get a chance to kind of like form like a big group and say, hey, we're not going to put up with this shit anymore. And I'd say the last job I was at, and part of the reason why I'm doing the gig economy now is I was an Amazon delivery driver. And it was like
Mm.
the job itself was fine. I actually kind of like being a delivery driver, but it was like the way that the company was treating me was like just so shitty that like by the time I got out of there, I mean, I was ready to like, I mean, I was pissed off. You know what I mean? Like I was like ready to like fucking throw blows and stuff. It's like they were doing some shady shit, and it's like I told my girlfriend, I was like, I'm surprised people are putting up with this shit because it's like, I mean, you're just trying to like fucking feed your family and shit, and it's like they're just like abusing you.
Mm.
So yeah, in terms of, I know there's a lot we could go on forever, but in terms of socialism, is there anything that I missed? Because I feel like
Um,
there's a lot to it. I want to make sure we cover everything, and then we can just wrap things up.
Gosh, you know, I mean, I could, it's a conversation you could have for days and you still wouldn't cover everything. But
Yeah,
I think we've discussed the basics, you know, like to sum it up in a nutshell, socialism is a system based on the common ownership of resources and machinery. Everybody has equal access to, you know, universal basic services, and people contribute to keep it running. You can have a debate about how or when we can achieve that. You can have a debate about which countries are closest to it. But at the end of the day, that's the basic idea. That's what we should be working towards as a planet. Um, yeah, and I'll tell you what. I mean, I don't agree with everything they say, but if you want to find out more about it, go look at something called the World Socialist Movement. Um, which is like this coalition of political parties in different countries that promote these ideas. In Britain, we have the Socialist Party of Great Britain. In America, you have the World Socialist Party USA. They have loads and loads of great articles on their website that sort of discusses these ideas, you know, how would it work? And also a lot of things about why it didn't work in the past, why it failed in Russia, why Norway and Sweden are not quite as good as everyone thinks they are, and stuff like that. So if you want to read more about socialism, go look at their website.
yeah. I mean, my main thing is it's kind of like with Scandinavia. From like you just said, they're not as good as you think they are. But my main thing is just kind of like taking care of your own or whatever. It's kind of like I don't really we don't necessarily, I feel like we don't, even though I would like to probably be socialist, I think that we don't necessarily need, we don't necessarily need to be socialist. It's just a matter of like, if someone needs help, let's fucking help. You know what I mean? Like if somebody's on the street, if somebody's starving, healthcare, like I've been doing, like since I lost my job and now I'm doing the gig economy, they don't really give you healthcare. So like I'm actually on the government healthcare, the Medi-Cal or whatever right now, but it's like, so that's nice, but it's like the whole thing is a pain in the ass. Like when you lose your job, then suddenly you don't have, not only do you not have money, you don't have health insurance. Like what? Like let's at least start with healthcare, like you guys have in most of the country, I think has.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, and
That would
the
certainly be a step in the right direction.
yeah, I mean, let's at least move a step in the right direction. But when I was talking to the last guy about communism, I think that he was kind of getting a little bit defensive with me because I was asking questions that I asked you, like, would you want to live in China? But it was more of like a devil's advocate type thing. Like, I'm saying this is what people will ask if, like, I brought it up to like people like my dad and stuff, and it's like he just is like it doesn't work or whatever, and it's like, so I was asking him questions that like you might get when you're defending it, but I was saying, well, what's the next step? Is I don't really see America going communist, and he's like, you got it, just kind of like boots on the ground. And the problem with that, you know what I mean? It's like get kind of like he was like saying, like you kind of said, like get active, like get involved, that's what you have to do. And the unfortunate, the sad, it's sad because I just don't see America really doing that, unless, like I was saying, with the AI and the robots, we're literally get to a point where like we're just forced to, like with
Yeah.
like with the actors right now and the writers, they're scared that they're going to be their jobs are going to be taken over, so they're doing something about it. So maybe we're going in the right direction in terms of that. Um, but yeah, so do you have? I know we've gone over already. So do you
No
have
worries.
a podcast or anything like that that people, or any type of social media that people can check you out on?
I actually don't. I don't have podcasts, no, and I don't use social media as well because I find it tends to eat into my free time quite a lot. So I've not had Twitter or Facebook anything for quite a long time. Um, I'm active in British politics. You know, I'm happy to talk about my ideas, but I don't have a Twitter you can go and look me up on and tell me why I'm wrong and should kill myself.
You're kind of,
Um,
you don't have any social media. You're actually, really doing it. Like you're actually like working in the political systems, right?
I'm a member of a political party in Britain called the Breakthrough Party, and which is Democratic Socialist, and I'm quite active with them. But you know, I'm here to promote these ideas, not to promote myself, if that makes sense. Um, but if you follow politics in the UK, maybe my name will crop up one day. We'll see. Um, but you know, like the only thing I could plug is go look at the website of the World Socialist Movement and see what they say about it, because they'll tell you everything you need to know. And answer a lot of the common criticisms as well, which are fair criticisms. Like you say, you know, it's really, really important to play devil's advocate. And I'm happy to answer the difficult questions, because if we're ever going to convince people why what we're doing is right, we need to be able to answer the tough questions. So, yeah, go look at
Yeah,
their
and it's like
website.
I'm not even asking the questions to try and corner you. It's because I agree with you, and the same with the other guy. But it's more like these are the questions that people will ask. But yeah,
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
so you're looking to be a politician as opposed to a lawyer at this point. Like you think you'll that's the goal?
Well, I don't want to be a politician, but I want to be involved in politics because it's something I care about. You know, it's something I'd like to do in my spare time. In terms of what I do to earn money, well, we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah. Okay. So the last question that I ask everybody is: you don't have a podcast, but are there any good podcasts to listen to? Movies, TV shows, anything, music, anything that you're into? Otherwise, stuff that's like maybe good to listen to or watch on this subject of socialism.
Okay, that's actually a really interesting question. Oh, in terms of podcasts, there is a podcast by an academic called David Harvey, who's sort of this left-wing academic, and it's called where is it? Let me find it. The Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey, and he's an English professor, but he's lived in America since the 1970s, and he talks a lot about left-wing ideas, and I think he's really, really good. So go listen to his podcast. In terms of movies, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. In terms of music, oh, there's loads of great left-wing music out there. Go listen to Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie, all the old American folk singers. They have great, great sort of left-wing music.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, thanks for coming on, Uther, and
Thank you very much
thanks
for
for
having me.
no problem. Thanks for listening, guys. And I'll talk to you real quick after the podcast. All right.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.